really my pleasure to introduce Chris Jones. Chris has, I guess, a big footprint in the muscular dystrophy world. He's a parent of a child with muscular dystrophy, but also really nationally or internationally known speaker. Talks about things that affect not just Duchenne muscular dystrophy, but probably all of you in your families. He has a website that has gotten acclaim all over the world called Mitchell's Journey that talks about his family story, and he's going to tell us a little about that story today as well. So, Chris, come on up, and we're so grateful to have you here with us today.
Welcome. Thank you for being here. Thank you for inviting me to spend a little time with you. My name's Chris Jones. I'm the father of a young boy who had muscular dystrophy, Duchenne in fact. I'm not a scientist, I'm not a doctor, I'm not a psychologist, I'm just a dad. I'm a dude that loves people. And I think over the last several years I've become something of a grief anthropologist. I've spent a lot of time exploring, anticipatory grief, what happens on the other side of medicine, and so I'm just grateful to spend a little bit of time with you and share some snapshots about finding hope. Dr. Butterfield had asked that we share a little bit of our story and then also some of the learnings we pick up from our journey, and I hope you find some value out of it. I just got back with Jeff, in fact. I'm a member of the board of PPMD, and I just want you to know that even that group itself is so dedicated to cracking the riddle of Duchenne, but I know so many others in the medical space that are so committed across all kinds of disorders to seek for a cure. In fact, just last week I was with Sarepta and had a chance to speak with them, and I could look into all these medical professionals' faces and I saw an intense desire to help people, to save lives, to improve the quality of life. And so there's a lot of reason for hope in the community. So how do we find and maintain hope? When you look at the definition of hope, I basically want to share the definition in just a moment, but we're going to do 5 things very quickly. We're going to talk about the deeper meaning of hope, a story of hope and hardship, which is my son's story, confronting the big question, a key to happiness, and lastly we'll talk very briefly about the healing power of gratitude. It wasn't many years ago, many months ago, last fall, my family and I went up one of the canyons recently and just went camping, and we do that regularly, and I couldn't help but think of how beautiful Utah is, and nature, and how seasons change. And as the sun set, we sat under the moon, and by the fire, we were talking about how seasons change and how life changes, and how important it is to just kind of go with the seasons. Instead of fighting it, we find life a lot easier when we can embrace the seasons. So hope, the definition. Here's one definition: an optimistic state of mind and expectation of positive outcomes. Right? That's how we often think of it. Another definition is a feeling of expectation, a desire for a certain thing to happen. Specifically, a person or a thing that might help or save someone. Another expansion of that definition is grounds for believing something good may happen. Now, the trouble with those definitions with hope is that sometimes it can be discouraging, because what we hope for doesn't always come to pass, and that can be very frustrating. I would love to live forever, but that's not going to happen. I would love to live a life free of hardship, and that's not going to happen. And my kids make fun of me. I really want to be Iron Man, and that's not going to happen. So what do we do with hope? What do we do with that definition? Does that definition cause more trouble than maybe it suggests? And there's an archaic definition that I think is so beautiful, and it is this: a feeling of trust. We'll talk about that a little bit further in a few minutes. So life is almost like getting a ticket to a roller coaster. And it wasn't, a few years ago we went to an NBA camp or event in Salt Lake, where my little son Mitchell was still with us, and my youngest son Wyatt was there. And I think I took 2 photos during this service. And the first one was life can be summarized in two images, right? This is how it starts, and this is often how it feels. I asked him last night, I showed him these pictures, and he goes, oh, I remember that day. That was the worst day of my life, he said. So, everything does change. I want to give you a quick synopsis. In 2009, we began a pretty rigorous discovery of how are we going to handle Duchenne Muscular Dystrophy diagnosis, for example, and we felt this increasing isolation. That everyone around us thought, oh, Mitchell looks fine, his calves look big. Did not know it was scar tissue, they thought it was muscle. And so that was really discouraging. We felt more and more isolated because people thought, you're going to dodge a bullet, you're going to be okay. Add to that, over time, certainty began to drop. As new conditions started to emerge, it became more and more uncertain. Medical complications over time became more intense and scary. The stress we felt continued to peak and valley throughout the years. But what I want to tell you is that hope and happiness was a constant throughout our journey, despite those difficulties that we encountered. We had many moments that were absolutely beautiful, despite the backdrop of trouble. And I'll share a couple of those. This image is rather symbolic, and we'll go there in just a moment. Buddha was said to have said this. I don't think he did, but whoever said it was right? The trouble is we think we have time. I think about just my little kids, how quickly they grew up. And there's a great saying that says, when you have kids, the years are long, but the days are short. No, the days are long, but the years are short, right? Days, sometimes I just want to go to bed and take a rest, but 1 minute later we look by and we realize years have passed. So here's my family. I have 4 kids and a lovely wife, and we're going to just focus briefly on Mitchell. He was born April 29, 2002. He was a perfect, cute, sweet little dude. We had no idea there was any trouble. He grew to be a very curious little boy. In the arms of his mother and family, he really enjoyed his life. But on July 11, 2005, he was diagnosed with Duchenne Muscular Dystrophy. And one thing you're going to see are snapshots. I'm just a habitual photojournalist. I take pictures of everything. And so these photos were taken within seconds of the diagnosis. And you could see my wife just kind of saying, what's going on? And I had to ask the doctor 3 times what it meant. I didn't know what she was talking about, even though she was using plain English. Pat Furlong once said that a chronic diagnosis is a family diagnosis. And I think that's such a valuable insight, that it's not just the patient, but also the caregivers that are then dealing with troubles associated with whatever that disorder is. These were some of the feelings we had. We felt like, in a way, we were sort of drowning. We had the diagnosis, then we immediately had anticipatory grief, and then loss, and then grief and anticipatory grief on top of that. It just seemed to feel like, things were sinking. But we were surrounded by brilliant doctors. And again, this is Dr. Flanagan when he was here in Salt Lake working with Mitch. He immediately went into a bunch of benchmark studies, and they were trying to check where he was with his muscle deterioration over the years. And again, just a happy boy, and was willing to endure any medical battery of tests that he was asked to do. My wife and I became instant Google doctors. We were studying everything, and that got a little scary. This image became something of a metaphor. I used this in my blog as sort of, I don't know what's going on, but I feel like the ground underneath us is beginning to separate. And we'll go back to that in a moment. Mitch participated in a lot of really sweet activities that were hosted by local groups, and one of which was the Special Olympics, which he had a lot of fun doing. Again, Mitch was just a great sport. I tried to be there all the time as a parent to let him know that I was there supporting him. I didn't want him to look in the waiting room or in the room and see an empty chair where his dad should have been. And so as often as I could, I tried to be there. So a few years had passed after the diagnosis, and Mitch, we discovered, had cardiomyopathy. Again, the wasting of the heart happened much earlier than anticipated. And it was interesting because it wasn't until about this time he had cardiomyopathy, we discovered that Mitch would look at other people performing things and say, I wish I could do that. I wish I could skate like these kids. And this was one moment where he said that, one of the very few moments. And so my wife did something really sweet. that very moment she said, okay, let's go do something. We went out to the field next to the skate park, and we started playing Mitchell's favorite game, which is run your brother over with the wheelchair. And you can see the delight on his face. And it was just a fun experience. So we took a hard moment and turned it upside down into something positive. We did something we could do. What's interesting is just across the street here, Mitchell, we would take him to go see his cardiologist, and we would see have all kinds of tests, and so the hardest crucible I've ever experienced in my life happened just across the street here. But I'm glad to be back, because I'm glad to be able to share some thoughts that I hope will be helpful. There came a point where Mitch his heart began to deteriorate even further, and we had to get an MRI. This is a quick video. I made these little videos and put them on my blog, because I wasn't the kind of person who's going to go tell my family, hey, here's the update. They could just go visit it if they felt they wanted to. So this was when we discovered his heart failure went from bad to super, super bad. And here we go.
Yeah, back in June it was sort of the upper limit of normal, and then around Halloween it was high, despite the medicines, and we'll see where we are today. And it doesn't, I don't need that number to tell me that his heart function's not very good, but what it can be helpful with is sort of gauging how well you're doing with your therapy.
Zen proverb, the obstacle is the path, is the one thing we had to realize to come to grips with. That was our thing to deal with. I wrote in a letter to my family talking about his heart failure, and I had one of my employees illustrate this. This was sort of a metaphor for how I was feeling, that my son was on the edge of a cliff that he couldn't see beneath him, and it was crumbling from beneath his feet. And what he thought was the sun rising on his life was the sun in fact setting. and this became a strong metaphor for what I was beginning to feel and experience. We had some really tender moments. So we learned that his heart was failing, and we asked the cardiologist, can we, with 5% heart, ejection fraction, can we go to Disneyland? And we just weren't educated that would have been a really dangerous move. So we didn't, but his grandpa came by and gave him a cute little puppy. And this was, again, one of the silver linings in a really dark time. And we'll just watch that quick little video of him getting his puppy.
Oh yes, come in. What do you think it is, Mitch?
It's something's moving.
Something but it's
a
lizard
or a
It's got a motor in it.
Something's moving.
It's got a motor in it. I told you it was a puppy, Mitch. I was just guessing, but what do you think, Mitch? It's like the cutest puppy ever.
It's got everything it needs except one thing. It needs an owner.
Like 6 weeks old. I never had a
That's
puppy.
it.
So that little puppy brought him a great deal of comfort. And one of the things I want to mention is that some of the most beautiful experiences I've ever had in my life have been punctuated with tears and in moments of great difficulty. Let me just give you a quick synopsis of really when things began to happen. So, Mitchell's heart failure happened just before he turned 9. Well, he was just before he turned 10. We discovered he had cardiomyopathy. And it became a real, it happened super fast. We thought we had time. And, but despite the window closing on us, we tried to take advantage of every moment we had with Mitch. And here's a quick snapshot of the EF decline. In May of, 2012, he had an ejection fraction of 25%. In October, he was at 21%. And then it began to fall like a rock off a cliff. No therapies would work, nothing. And he was asymptomatic because he was, relatively, he was ambulatory, but he wasn't really active like a regular kid, so there were no real symptoms. There was a time in December that he had, just right after Christmas morning, he was not feeling well. We thought he had the flu. Looking back, we know better, but those were signs of heart failure. What was going on at that very moment? He was sick, and then he had an event in January. He calls me in my basement apartment. He says, "Dad, I don't feel good." And I run upstairs into his room, and he's listless and pure white, and just like I thought I was losing him, and I just held him, and I said, "No, not now." And he kind of came back, and then in February we discovered, he had end-stage heart failure. So fast forward just a few weeks from the getting the puppy, he wakes up one morning, and Marley, his little dog, was always so aware of his needs and just kind of cuddled around him and gave him loves in a way that was unusual, because if she wasn't around him, she would be like a puppy and a little crazy, but she seemed to comfort him. But he woke up feeling very sick. So we take Mitch to the hospital, just here across the street. We thought, well, maybe the doctors can give him some medication and write him up and get him feeling better. And so that was, but when we told him he had cardiomyopathy and they checked his vitals, then they immediately rushed him into the examination room, and they realized things were super serious. And so they rushed him up to the cardiac intensive care unit, and he had an army of doctors trying to save his life. And he was scared. There's no doubt about it. That doctor, Dr. Herman, the one with his arm kind of out, in the gray scrubs, he was the doctor down in the ER, and he came up a few hours later just to see if Mitch even survived. He didn't think it was going to happen. We were really touched by the doctor's concern and care. He went from a team of 0 to a team of 12 people trying to save his life. And after a few x-rays and tests, we discovered that his heart condition was super, super bad. The attending cardiologist in the cardiac intensive care unit, with great compassion, came to us with tears in his eyes and said, "Your son has days to live." And my wife and I were mortified. And so we stayed a few days in the hospital trying to see if we could stem the tide of what the inevitable, and we got him a little better off. His vitals stabilized. I remember going down in the lobby in the gift shop, and I was looking for a teddy bear for Mitch, and I found this coin with the word gratitude. And I believe so deeply that gratitude is my guide through hard things. Because while the path before me may be dark, gratitude sort of serves as a light a little bit. So we had to sort of tuck our fear and scared feelings away and just try to make these moments in the hospital as positive as possible. They let us smuggle Marley into the hospital to give him some puppy therapy, but he wasn't feeling very well and he became weaker and weaker. His neurologist at the time had lost her daughter just a few years prior in that same wing, and so she came up to say goodbye to Mitch for the last time, despite her pain and her loss. And I think that was one of the most beautiful acts of compassion from a medical practitioner. And I'm so grateful for good doctors like Dr. Butterfield and so many others that care. They're smart, but they care. And there's a certain medicine for the soul there. Mitchell's wheelchair immediately became terrifying to me. It was the instrument of all that he was struggled with, and it was terrifying. We brought him home. We were blessed with an amazing hospice nurse that guided us through this process. I remember driving up to the street that morning, or the next morning, we discovered these yellow ribbons everywhere, like within a mile radius around our house. And it was just beautiful to see our neighbors care so much. He had visitors that he didn't even know come by to see him. And I remember Mitch looked up at me several times like, "Dad, you got me, right? I'm okay." And it was hard to manage information for a little boy who was scared but very much wanted to live. We focused on family. We looked at pictures through photo albums. I remember Mitch said to his mom, "Mom, my birthday feels so far away." His birthday's in April, and this is February, really early February. "Can I have an early birthday?" And it was almost like his intuition was just saying, get everything you can in as fast as you can. And so within 24 hours, Nat had a birthday party set up for Mitch, and he had this look of knowing, even though we didn't tell him at the time that he was at end stage. We knew our boy would worry, and we didn't want to scare him. But I think he kind of did. Well, I know he did. That's a really hard position to be in as a parent. But you know what we learned to do? We learned to put hope in the moment. We didn't know what tomorrow would bring, but we knew right now. And we could make today, this very moment, amazing. And that was the hardest part about this whole thing, is we didn't know if we had a few days, a few weeks, a few hours. This I tried to do, as my wife taught us, to turn a hard moment into a beautiful moment, the best we could. We had Nerf gun battles, which were epic, and it was a lot of fun as a family. And I remember I was giving him a bath, and he just would look at the PICC line that would send medicine. It was hard, and he said, "God, I wish I didn't have to have this." It was just so tender, and we really tried to again just love him. But at some point, we had to tell him what was going on. And this was the head doctor over the hospice program, and he had come over to check out Mitchell's blood, and I could tell he looked on his face that things were dire, and things got worse. And we had to say the hardest goodbye of our lives. It's one thing, I thought I knew what was going to happen. I thought I would know how to handle it, and it's different. It's harder than I imagined. But again, even after Mitchell, our son, passed, we did the best we could to turn our grief and hard moments into something beautiful. Now I want to turn the camera away from my son's story and talk about each of us in this room and just a few things that we have picked up along the way. And I'm trying to compress this because of time, just to make sure we can get through some of these key points. You know, we cannot change what we're not aware of, but I think oftentimes once we're aware of things, we can't help but change. I think that's a truism I've seen play out in people's lives over and over. Now, there was a time before all of us knew we existed. Let me explain what that means. If you look at the timeline of a human life, when we were tiny, tiny babies, at some point between the age of 1 and 2, we became aware of our physical selves. We'd look ourselves in the mirror, we'd see our hands, we'd realize that we were a body. Then we became aware of our emotional self as we get a little older, 2 to 3 years roughly. You know, little kids will say, well, I'm hungry, and if I'm hungry, the world's hungry. You know, and we become emotional. And then we begin to develop a sense of ourselves, conscious of ourselves as an individual. And then at some point, in our early years, we have what they call our concrete consciousness, our concrete self. And it's like, it's where rules emerge. I learned in elementary school, you do this is how you treat people. And then what happens in life is we tend to just sort of stay there. And if we're lucky, we'll have a crisis in our life. Now, I know that sounds so opposite of everything we hope for. But a crisis can often get us out of ruts. They can help us look deeper into our lives about the meaning and purpose of all that we're experiencing. And so here's how a couple of these things will show up. So we learn like rules for nature. You know, if I drop something or touch a hot pan, I get burned. I learned stuff in school. You know, 1 plus 1 is 2. I learned the laws of the land. I learned a profession. I learned all these rules about how to live. And that's, again, when we're younger, we just learn rules. And then we learn religious rules, family life, societal rules, all these rules that tell us how to be. But what happens when we get experience in life later on is things don't turn out as we plan. You know, the expectations and our realities come clashing. And I've seen, again, on my blog, you know, I talk to thousands of people, and they struggle with how do I make sense of what I hoped versus what's happening. And the big question we should be asking is, what's the meaning of it all? You know, we'll ask that question, life isn't going as planned. We have this existential crisis. I thought if I did A, B, and C, everything would work out, that I'd be happy. I did all the things I was told to do, yet it still didn't work out. And that's the crisis that people face so often. And so if we're not careful, we'll get into self-medication and distractions and other things that will rob life from life. And we mistakenly believe that the solution is somewhere out there instead of what's within. And that's what I learned through my son's journey, is that nothing would take away my pain. I had to just do the hard work of examining what's going on and what am I to take out of this. So the most important transition of our lives, in my opinion, is going from avoiding the question, I don't want to think about that, that's too scary, to confronting the question and then discovering the meaning and purpose. That seems to be one of the most powerful mechanisms to get into asking the question and discovering meaning and purpose. Last year I was with my wife and I, we went to Ireland to speak to a group of muscular dystrophy group. And in the place we were speaking, I noticed 2 posters that I thought were fascinating. This one, age-old wisdom, let suffering be thy teacher. Goes back to that question of what's the meaning and purpose of all this? What can I take away from this? Our quality of life improves when we transition from focusing on what happens to us to how we respond and what we can learn. So where there's hope, I believe, when we have trust, we can find happiness. I wrote this in one of my blogs. This was just after Mitchell was denied a heart transplant. And I said, I often wondered about the relationship between grief and gratitude. At first, they would seem polar opposites, as different from each other as oil and water, fire and ice, love and hate. Yet the more I come to experience grief and gratitude, the more I begin to see they play an important symbiotic role. Grief tells our heart things like, how can I possibly find joy again when so much is lost? Gratitude responds softly, yes, it hurts, but what a blessing it is, even if only for a short time. Grief screams, it commands and demands. Gratitude whispers, it is soft and subtle. Grief sees only what is lost. Gratitude sees what is gained. There's a certain plurality between grief and gratitude. I've learned those two can coexist. They can live with each other. Hurt and happiness, fear and hope, and so many other contrasts. Learning to live in the contrast is a state of power, I've learned. That we can learn to live in the contrast. University had done a big study about where does human happiness come from. Now, this thing is about a 100-year-old study, and it's ongoing. It's happening right now. And what they did is they wanted to see what would happen if we could watch people's lives play out like a movie. Well, again and again, generation to generation. What would happen? What would we learn about human happiness? They tracked the lives of 724 people over 80 years. Again, since the study, another 2,000 of their children were added to the study as well. And they took them out of two socioeconomic backgrounds, wealthy and impoverished. They wanted to see, is there any difference between resources and happiness? The author said, one of the guys running the program said, when the study began, nobody cared about empathy or attachment, but it turns out the key to happiness is relationships. Relationships, relationships. It didn't matter if you were rich or poor or anything in between. Relationships were the #1 factor as to our happiness. 3 big lessons they pulled out: that social connections are really good for us. Isolation is not. Loneliness creates toxicity. And again, this is empirical. This is out of research they did. The quality of relationships that we have matter, and that living in the midst of conflict resulted in poor health. So when there were conflicts in the relationships, they were less healthy. And then lastly, good relationships are really good for our brains. So this is it. The sum of this study that's continually proving out to be this way is that good relationships keep us happier and healthier, period. So if relationships are key to happiness, that's one thing I've always encouraged people that I speak with to take a close look at their relationships. What can I do to feed those closest to me? How can I resolve conflicts and develop a closer relationship with the ones I love? So one other quote here that I liked, which was, "In complete darkness, we are one and the same." In human beings, there's absolutely no difference when it's dark. Now, I think of that in a metaphorical perspective. One of the things that I found very helpful for me in my struggle with grief and disease was this. I learned that when things got dark, that I would start to look at moments that I was grateful for. Now, I don't care what your religious beliefs, if you have any religious beliefs, but when I look at little blessings in my life, I consider points of light. And what I found is that as I started connecting the dots between these points of light, these things I could be grateful for, I began to see a web, an interconnectedness, that things happened 10 years ago that showed up to my benefit today. And so I found that by doing the exercise of journaling, I'm grateful for this happened. Oh yeah, you know what happened 5 years later? There's a connection I never saw in the moment. And when I did that, I found gratitude for the past and the present. And in doing that, what I found by gathering all these little points of light in my life is that I was able to now have faith or hope or trust in the future.